Hello, and in this food law video we're talking about the topic of clean meat. Now, clean meat is something that there's been a lot of press and discussion about, but I think the reality of it actually hitting our supermarket shelves is a long way off, Katrina. And it might just be helpful to draw some distinctions, because there's a lot of different products out there that talk about being meat or a meat alternative. So let's just be clear as to what we mean here in terms of clean meat.
So what we're really talking about here is what scientists would call cultured or lab-grown meat. So this is meat. We'll come back to that in a minute, but this is a food, shall we say, that is genetically identical to a type of meat, so be that beef or chicken. It's not a meat alternative. It's not like tofu. It's not like the sort of plant-based protein things which are designed to replicate meat that we see on the market. It is actually genetically identical to meat as it is normally produced from an animal, and it's not currently on the market anywhere, as far as we know, in the world. Although there are some companies which are making huge strides in this area, and do think that they will have products in the foreseeable future. Right now, it's not being sold to consumers, and it's certainly not being sold to consumers in the EU.
The sort of thought of lab-grown meat, clean meat, I mean, even the word and the terminology around it actually, I think, has quite a big sort of impact on how consumers are going to receive this product.
Yes.
There's been some studies and or people have looked at this, haven't they? And there's generally a better acceptance of that topic or the label clean meat rather than lab-grown meat.
Yes, absolutely. And what those studies have really shown is actually how we talk about that meat, how we label it, how we describe it, is going to be very influential on whether this technology takes off. Producing meat as we do now has a huge environmental impact. We have a growing population. We do need technologies that will address those issues, and this is certainly one of them. So getting the consumer acceptance piece right is going to be very important. So the battle about how this can be described on the label is going to be very, very important to how successful these businesses are.
So that takes us to the interesting question of, can we actually call it meat? I mean, legally, can we call it meat? I mean,
Yes.
It's presumably going to be a novel food, is my first sort of starting point with it.
Well, I mean, it certainly hasn't been on the EU market in the past, so I think one has to assume that one would need novel food regulation. And in actual fact, the regulations themselves allude to this type of technology. So I think it is pretty fair to say that approval as a novel food will be a precursor, and it is possible that that approval will, when it comes, if it comes, will actually put certain requirements in terms of labelling onto the food. So that is certainly a possibility that it will be mandated in that way. But if it's not, we'll obviously have to think about how those foods fit into the existing regulatory regime, and particularly food information for consumers.
Because there is a definition in the Food Information for Consumers regulations about meat, or a definition for meat. But it very much talks about, it is, I mean, understandably assumes that it's an animal that has been slaughtered, which has produced the meat, because it uses phrases like skeletal muscles. It talks about muscles having naturally included or adherent tissue. So those sort of two words, skeletal, naturally included or adhered to, gives that impression that it's actually coming from a live animal. So the existing definitions we have of meat would probably exclude clean meat as it's so defined. But I think that's interesting about the conditions that may be imposed upon it, because of course we do have other foods that have gone through processes, maybe they've been irradiated or frozen now, where you have to include on your label some kind of description about how that particular ingredient, say, has been produced. I think, what do you think? I mean, in terms of consumers and finding that information useful, I can see that there are both positives and negatives with that. I mean, on the one hand, a consumer, and particularly somebody who was very environmentally aware, or even possibly a consumer that maybe was a vegan or a vegetarian, may well say, well, actually, I feel comfortable eating clean meat and I want the label to give me the information about the product so that I know that I am making that choice.
Yes. Yes, and there is certainly an argument that not to include that information could be misleading as to the production or manufacture of that product, which is another requirement under FIX. So there will definitely be consumers that want to know this. I think it will also, though, be a journey, because if these products take off, if they become effectively quite normal products, perhaps after a while it won't be misleading anymore, because consumers will understand that about their products generally. Perhaps they'll even think that it's better, and therefore it may be that over time what is misleading shifts and we don't need that information anymore.
What about the farming lobbying unit? I mean, this has significant impacts, doesn't it, for them? And actually, they've been looking at this in the States. There's been a movement to define beef, I think it is, so that beef is very clearly identified with slaughtered cattle and couldn't be applied to this type of clean meat product. And I think it's understandable why we may see more lobbying and more sort of movement towards that by the farming sector of the food chain, to try and ensure that the product is properly described and protected even.
Yes, well, I mean, they, at least at the moment in the States, are taking the view that true meat or meat is actually something that comes from an animal, and they're pushing very hard to protect that and to protect words like beef, and say actually it is inherently misleading to use those on packaging. It's not just about disclosing how it was made, it's actually a misleading term in of itself. And it is without a doubt a possible argument, and I think that as and when we have some of these foods approved via the novel foods process, it's something that is going to be thought about very seriously here, because obviously there are farming groups who have interests, but also who, I think they will believe very powerfully in the value of what they're doing and the value that brings to consumers, and want to be able to communicate that, much as the dairy industry has been very protective about dairy terms like cheese and milk, that those convey the benefits of dairy, not just dairy alternatives.
Well, I think this is going to be a space to watch. This is not happening now, but this is certainly coming in the future. And if actually the clean meat process can be scaled up so that it makes sense economically, both in terms of the scale of the manufacturing, but also the cost of doing so, then I think this could be a very viable alternative, and the law will need to keep up with it.
It will indeed.